But to say that any of that left Putin so little room to do anything other than invade its neighbor in 2022, that NATO expansion has to be seen as causing Russia to invade, I think is nuts. Of course Russia had a range of options.
Who bears primary responsibility for this conflict in Ukraine? And it seems to have polarized into two different trains of thought. And for whatever reason, people have just chosen sides on these two trains of thought, right? Yep. So the media itself, I think, is very much clearly kind of on the side of, Ukraine, the United States. This is primarily Putin's war, and he and Russia are to blame. Mm-hmm. But there is a very prominent political scientist. His name is John Mearsheimer. He's a political scientist and international relations scholar, described as the most influential realist of his generation. And he makes the argument that the West, primarily the United States and NATO, are to blame for this conflict in Ukraine. So I want to talk about that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Mearsheimer's wrong. How's that? Just for
that's a great way to start.
Bottom line up front, and I will try to explain why I think he's wrong. But I have to preface that by saying he is among academics who study international politics, he's extremely prominent as a theorist, and I want to stress that as a sort of big picture theory. This is how international politics work, and he's known as a sort of extreme, might be a strong word, but a very He advances this very stark notion of realism or realpolitik as a way of explaining what goes on in international politics. And I'm going to make that part of my criticism, which is he's really known as a theorist, not as somebody who actually knows anything about Ukraine or Russia. And he gets some stuff wrong about Ukraine and Russia because he doesn't, I think, know a lot about it. And that's not really a criticism in the sense of that's never been what he's done. He's been international relations. I also want to say that he and I have gone at this once at a conference about this specific question of Ukraine and Russia. And he is an extremely generous debater. He's very famous. I'm not so famous. He listened to what I had to say. He was thoughtful. He was polite. And he just said, no, you're wrong. And so now I'm going to be equally polite, I hope, and say, sorry, but he's wrong. The problem with trying to say exactly how he's wrong is it's one of these kind of arguments that he makes that almost every sentence of it has something in it that's wrong or slightly wrong or a misinterpretation. And so it's very hard to pick it apart without taking 2 hours to do it. But
let's try.
Okay, let's try. And I am, let me try to get to the simplest point. He advocates the school of thought known as realism, which is basically that, and his version of realism is that states will always expand if they can, right? States want more power. That's the basic idea of realism is that security is scarce, so states want power, and you can never have too much, right? That's realism in a nutshell. And so one of my problems with Mearsheimer talking about Ukraine and Russia, besides the fact that he doesn't really know very much about Ukraine and Russia, is that when he talks about Ukraine and Russia, he contradicts everything he's ever written about international politics, which is on the one hand, he says the United States shouldn't do these things. And it's like, well, you've written all these books saying that that's what great powers do. So he's on the one hand, he's asking the United States not to behave like he says all great powers do. Right.
Is he asking that question, or is he just saying that the primary cause or the catalyst for Russia's actions are the United States and NATO actions?
You sent me this video for him that he made to watch, and it's made fairly recently, right? And he specifically talks about assigning blame, right? He's not just talking about causality in the social science sense of something causes something else. He wants to assign blame, right? And so I think it's fair then to say that he's assigning blame, right? And so to me, he's contradicting himself twice. One is in expecting the United States not to behave like a great power, but then on the other hand, he's pretending that Russia is not going to behave like a great power. I mean, the thing that I find most incomprehensible about what he says, and what I think is not only not realist, but is the height of naivete, is that he seems to have this idea that if you left Vladimir Putin alone, he would mind his own business and Russia would be this peaceful country. And I don't think there's a lot of evidence from the 22 years that Putin's been in power now, or frankly for Russia for the 10 years or 9 years of post-Soviet Russia before Putin came to power. I don't think there's any evidence to say that that's true. So on the one hand, his theory says you would expect Russia to try to expand its influence. And we've got all this evidence that Russia is trying to expand its control of its neighbors. And yet Mearsheimer somehow thinks that Russia is neither being expansionist as we've seen or as his theory predicts. I just don't
yes, I was going to say, so is Mearsheimer right about his great power theory, and then in its application in this specific scenario, he's just completely got it wrong in the case of assigning blame, for instance?
So among realists, among people who identify themselves as realist theorists of international politics, most people think Mearsheimer goes too far, right? And again, now I'm talking about international relations theory, not about Russia-Ukraine, because basically Mearsheimer says that countries will inevitably, great powers will inevitably be expansionist, right? Where there's lots of other theorists that say that they're not necessarily expansionists, but that their insecurity puts them in a situation where the things that one country does to try to make itself safer tends to make others feel less safe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's what we call the security dilemma, right? You try to make yourself more safe, maybe by expanding NATO, but that makes somebody else feel less safe. And so then there's this action reaction. And so again, when Mearsheimer says somebody has to be to blame, there is an enormous school of realist political thought that says no, right? That says this is the tragedy. Mearsheimer's famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And the tragedy is that great powers find themselves in conflict with one another, even when neither of them is expansionist. Because the things they do to try to make themselves safe make their neighbors less safe. And there's a response.
So regardless of the actions that NATO and the United States took, was it in 2014? Like there was talk about having Georgia and Ukraine join NATO, and this apparently was a major security threat to Russia. You're saying regardless of those actions, Russia would have acted aggressively as a great power?
What I am saying, the short answer is yes, and more to the point, I'm saying it did. So the famous meeting he's talked about, and in the video that you had me show, he got the year wrong, but I'm not going to blame him for that. Talking off the cuff, you get years wrong all the time. It was 2008. It was the Bucharest summit of NATO, and we should talk about this in some detail because it's worth getting it right. But before we get to 2008, the point I'm making is that Russia had taken over a chunk of Moldova all the way back in 1992. It had taken a chunk of, or had its proxies take a chunk of Georgia all the way back in the early 90s, right? So how can NATO expansion be causing Russian aggression if Russian aggression predates NATO expansion by years, right? Not to mention, right, one of the other things that's really wrong with what Mearsheimer does is he often says, Putin said this, Russia said this, as though we should, every time Putin says he doesn't like something, that means we shouldn't do it, right? But if we're going to take Putin and Russian leader at their words, then go back to what they were saying in 1991, at the very moment the Soviet Union broke up, which was Ukraine cannot be separate from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's an incredible exercise in sort of selective and contradictory use of the evidence to try to get to a predetermined conclusion. Mm-hmm. We might have a discussion about why Mearsheimer likes that conclusion and therefore works his way backwards to get to it. But maybe we should talk about the Bucharest summit and the whole question of Ukrainian membership in NATO.
Yeah, so let's actually table that, and we'll get into that. I just want to spend a little bit more time on this argument because, as I started off saying, these are the polarized viewpoints now, right? It's like this, you're on the Mearsheimer side or you're on the mainstream side, as they call it, right? And the fact of the matter is, one of these sides has to be right, and one of them is going to be wrong. And when we look at maybe there is some gray area and there's some overlapping issues, right? So maybe a lot of Mearsheimer's points are correct in some context, but is this the prevailing actual view of what we're going to judge it in, 10, 15 years from now, essentially?
Yeah, there are still histories of the origins of World War II that blame World War II on the West, right?
Are those taken seriously?
They are. It's the idea that the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I put Germany in such a position that it was sort of guaranteed to go do what it did 15 or 20 years later, and that Western policies throughout the 30s, when we could have sort of walked away from the Versailles Treaty, in fact, continue to enforce things like German reparations, that we caused Hitler. And there are very respectable people who still believe that.
Yeah, so maybe there were some mistaken policies that heightened the likelihood of someone like Hitler coming to power and doing what he did. But at the end of the day, the fault of that war and the genocide and everything is because of this highly duplicitous bad actor on the world stage, though, right?
So here's to get to the current situation, right? I think reasonable people did and can debate the wisdom of NATO expansion, right? But I don't think any reasonable person would say that once that happened, it was so inevitable that 10 or 15 years later, and I want to stress, right, NATO never did offer membership to Ukraine or Georgia, right? And so this is one of the points is from NATO's perspective, they did on Ukraine and Georgia, they did exactly what Russia wanted, which is to say, no, we're going to kick that down the road till the future. But to say that any of that left Putin so little room to do anything other than invade its neighbor in 2022, that NATO expansion has to be seen as causing Russia to invade, I think is nuts. Of course, Russia had a range of options. In 2009, it didn't invade. In 2010, it didn't invade. In 2011, it didn't invade. It was never forced to invade. This was a war of choice. And you can both think that NATO enlargement was a misstep and think that this is Russia's responsibility, this war. The two are not contradictory.
And it's important. Like you said, it seems that Mearsheimer is assigning blame. And
assigning blame. He says that very candidly.
Yes, and I think that it's kind of a dangerous territory to wade into when you're doing that, because then you're choosing sides in something that's very, very significant, where hundreds of thousands of people's lives are at stake, and how we respond to that is really going to be determined by how we view this, and who is the right actor here and who's the wrong actor here, right?
Yeah, Mearsheimer's what he's been saying recently, and again, for example, the video the link you sent me, it sounds incredibly similar to what Putin himself is saying, right? And I don't think anybody thinks that Mearsheimer is Putin's tool. He's what that used to be sometimes known as a useful idiot, which is he's not controlled by anybody. He just happens to be saying stuff that's useful. But there are consequences because he's so influential. What he says does matter. And I would say he could, let's just say for when we may think he's right, he's wrong. There's a responsibility when you say the things he's saying to be right and to have done your homework.
What exactly then is he advocating for, or his side advocating for at this point, now that Russia has invaded Ukraine?
Yep.
What is the next steps from his point of view?
Yeah, and I want to go back. What this is, what if you ask what's really driving Mearsheimer, and I think what's driving it, if you read his most recent book, what's driving Mearsheimer is his frustration and maybe even anger is a strong word over what he sees as the United States overextending itself around the world. He sees Ukraine as an example of this, but of course, what he was really concerned about was Iraq and Afghanistan, in ways that he sees as extremely negative for U.S. national interests down the road. Mm-hmm. This is so. I think, in a sense, he's saying some things that a lot of, I would say, I'm sympathetic with, which is that the Iraq War did immense damage to the United States. and to, lots of things. I just don't happen to think that saying the Iraq war was a mistake has any necessarily implication for what you think about the Ukraine war. But I think he's gotten into this bigger thing that he's very staunchly against American overreach, and in particular about what he would call liberalism, which is the idea that the world could be a nice place. So what he's saying in Ukraine is you have to accede to the fact that Russia is closer to Ukraine than we are. It has more ability to project power there, and it has a bigger interest than we do. And you simply, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, you simply have to accept that Russia's going to take over Ukraine. And so I think, and now I'm reading into him because I haven't seen him specifically say this, but a lot of people who hold some of the same views are basically saying the best thing that the United States can do now, or the West can do for Ukraine, is help it negotiate a peace. And they would generally counsel negotiating a peace on Russia's terms, because the argument is, right, Russia's got all the cards to play here.
Mm-hmm. But isn't this so right now when you say negotiating a peace, it almost looks like some sort of ceasefire arrangement where Russia might walk away with a couple of territories, but they're not walking away with what their strategic goals were initially, right? Like,
this depends on what you believe Russia's strategic goals were initially, and there's been some, let's just say, lack of transparency about that. Again, this if you start taking Putin at his word, the problem with taking Putin at his word is some of the things he says are incredibly scary and are incredibly far-reaching, but they're not always fully consistent with one another.
Like what?
Well, sometimes it seems like sometimes it seems like all he really wants is for Ukraine not to be part of NATO. Sometimes it seems like what he's saying is Ukraine has to be part of Russia. That's an example.
Mm-hmm.
Medvedev, his former prime minister, was talking the other day about Warsaw, and right before the invasion, Putin was talking, not about creating the former Soviet Union, but about the Russian Empire, right? And again, the Russian Empire went a lot into what is today's Poland. So trying to figure out, like, if Putin were able to do it, where would he draw the western border of Russia? That's the game. And I think Mearsheimer is terrifically naive about that. He based on that if we leave Russia alone, it will leave its neighbors alone. And not only is there 800 years of history that says otherwise, but every word that comes out of Putin's mouth says otherwise, and all of Russia's behavior says otherwise.
And it goes against Mearsheimer's argument, like you said before, right? Like Russia will just expand and expand. This is what great powers do, Absolutely. Is that they expand.
So if I sound exasperated, this is why I'm exasperated, is because this is an incredibly smart guy, an incredibly accomplished scholar who I think, and this is where I think a lot of scholars, not only in the United States, but many in Western Europe, have kind of run off the rails on this, is the argument that if the United States has screwed things up, that must mean that other people are not doing bad things, right? And this gets back to the point about blame, which is there is plenty of room to say that the United States is to blame for all sorts of things. And yet, Russia started this war, right? There's the old line from the song is nobody's right if everybody's wrong. I'm still going to say that, at least from the perspective of Central Europe, the United States has not been as aggressive as Russia has. The big thing about this, too, is about Ukraine is Ukraine has said over and over again it wants to join the West. And so all that the West is doing is sort of facilitating what the Ukrainians themselves say they want. Mm-hmm. What Russia is saying is that what the Ukrainians themselves say they want is unacceptable to us as Russia, and therefore we're invading. And so part of what Mearsheimer is saying, either explicitly or implicitly, is that the democratically expressed will of the Ukrainian people is irrelevant. And that's pretty far-reaching, if you ask me. And there is that school of U.S. foreign policy that says promoting democracy, and I think Mearsheimer believes this, that promoting democracy around the world is a dangerous game for the United States because it deludes us into things like our Afghanistan adventure or our Iraq adventure. Mm-hmm. The funny thing is, as right as it might have been about those two places, the Ukrainians have been making a pretty good go of democracy with all kinds of flaws.
Yeah, there's a difference between this overt exertion of power in promoting democracy and essentially just supporting states who want to be democratic, right? There's a major, major difference there. And that seems to be, we learned a lot, I think, from Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah.
And, you know, the United States doesn't want to get engaged in crazy, you know, games, war games, you know, outside of its sphere of influence, I think. Yeah. And so it's interesting that this argument is being made. Now, I just want to shift slightly because I want to talk slightly about, you know, this Noam Chomsky train of thought, essentially. You know, there's American genocide, American imperialism, where this is it's greater than what any other nation is doing. It's worse on the world stage because of the scale of what the United States is capable of, right? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, if we talk about what the United States is capable of, actually, I mean, I'd have to go look up the exact numbers of nuclear warheads, but let's just say either Russia or the United States, or for that matter, China, France, and the UK can deploy enough nuclear weapons to ruin everybody's day. But it is true in some important respects that the United States is, if you put it all together, economic power, soft power, and so on, probably is still more powerful than any other single country in the world. I think that's beside the point, but that's fine. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, Chomsky's, of course, been a critic of U.S. foreign policy going back to the Vietnam War. And, of course, again, he's been right about a lot of things. But he has this, just as though I think it's incredibly naive and dangerous to act like every American exercise of power, because it's by the United States, is good, it's equally dangerous to assume that every American exercise of power, because it's American, is therefore bad, which is what Chomsky does on the left, and what Mearsheimer, who's more on the right, kind of does the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's the same fallacy as if some of what we do is bad, then it's all got to be bad. And unfortunately, that's not the case.
It's this whataboutism that we had talked about before, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, I mean, and again, think of the United States' role in Europe, and I think you and I have talked about this, but yeah, the United States in 1940, 41, 42 could have said, you know what, Germany's not our business, right? The Europeans are Europeans, let's stay home. And you would have been, and we don't know exactly how that would have turned out, but ultimately you probably would have had the Soviet Union taking over the entire continent, right? Led by Joseph Stalin, with all the stuff that we know that Stalin did. You know, would the world be a better place? Would the United States be a happier place in 2022 if, you know, some weird version of the Man in the High Castle had turned out to be true? I'm not convinced.
So it seems
that was an obscure reference, but my point is, if either the Nazis or the Soviets had taken over Europe, you know, the United States in the 1940s said, you know what, those are both bad alternatives. And I actually think the United States was right to do that, but it required us exerting both military and economic power, as well as, right, promoting democracy.
Yeah. So it seems like, you know, we have two alternatives here. You know, it's either somebody is going to exert influence and power, right, you know, and we have a choice. Do you want authoritarian regimes to do that? Or do you want free democratic societies to do that? Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of mistakes when free democratic societies do that. But in the long run, we've made the choice. Those are the type of societies we want to live in and have grow stronger, right?
Well said.
And so I think it's very, very important to talk about these type of things. And it's interesting because some of the friends I talk to who might not really, you know, understand global geopolitics, they have this naive understanding of the world. It's like, well, why doesn't everybody just kind of mind their own business and you know, just chill out? Like, why is Russia invading Ukraine? Why is NATO expanding? Why does this institution even exist? It's just kind of like, why are these conflicts happening? Why are people dying? Is this something we could get into? Like, kind of.
I mean, it would be nice if everybody minded their own business, right? But countries don't. You know, mm-hmm. Hitler, Stalin, Putin, they try to take over their neighbors. And you know, again, we can say, well, the United States did this, the United States did that. And the United States, I think, has to be accountable for what it's done. But you know, we talk about NATO expanding. NATO didn't get out of the bed one morning and invade the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, right? Those countries begged, NATO to be let in. And again, that's the fundamental difference is NATO lets in countries after those countries have asked and asked and asked again and met certain standards. And of course, Ukraine would love to have been let into NATO, and NATO said, no, we won't do it because we know it's going to piss off the Russians, right? The Russians don't ask you what you want. Mm-hmm. They don't say, well, you can come in if you meet certain standards. They say, we're coming whether you like it or not. And if you think there's some moral equivalence there, that's great, but then I don't know what your notion of morality is. Mm-hmm. To say that giving some other country a free choice to join your organization is the same as compelling them to join your organization.
No, well said, Paul. I think what you've just said, it really just encompasses the argument or encompasses a viewpoint that's so important to be heard and sometimes doesn't get seen. Because first of all, it's a very nuanced viewpoint. And I think that's what makes it so difficult for people to understand, because they get dragged into these information bubbles and there's only one viewpoint being expressed. And really, I think the discussion we're trying to have is that there's no, complete right or wrong. It's a highly nuanced situation, but without a doubt, I think there is going to be one side that is going to be shown to be more right in the light of history. Just like today, we realize that Western exertion of power during the World Wars and during the Cold War, to some degree, stopped some of the greatest horrific tragedies from happening.
Yeah. Right. And what's funny about this is if you go back to the realists of the, you mentioned in your introduction, Mearsheimer is regarded as, one of the most, important contemporary realists. Well, his predecessors were people who, their sort of guiding philosophy was that in a world that has some bad actors, whether you like it or not, sometimes you have to exert power against bad actors, because if you don't confront bad actors, aggressive states, they will go and take over things that you care about. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's why there's this weird anti-realism of Mearsheimer's arguments about Ukraine and Russia. Is this just this idea that you cannot confront power, not confront aggression, not meet power with power, and assume that everybody's going to end up happy. Mm-hmm. That's idealism.
And this comes back to the point that you said something. You said states just eventually want to take over their neighbors. Is this just the reality because of human nature?
Well, I want to stress, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm saying that's what Mearsheimer has been writing for 40 years. Mm-hmm.
What is your viewpoint?
My viewpoint is that much more along the lines of saying security is difficult. And I don't think every state is aggressive. But I think that there is this natural tendency that when states try to guarantee their own security, it tends to, right, you get weapons and things like that. It tends to make your neighbors feel insecure. And so there is this natural tendency towards these, whether you call them arms races or just escalations of tensions, that it takes really careful, skilled diplomacy to mitigate. Mm-hmm. But it is possible. And I always use the example of Germany and France that fought 3 wars between 1870 and 1940. And now, 80 years after 1940, war between Germany and France seems incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. Right? And so security is not guaranteed. You have to look after it. Military power does matter. But if states are more or less satisfied with the status quo, they can find ways of reassuring each other about their weapons and so on. And so this goes back to another famous realist, a guy called Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, back before he was in the United States government and doing absolutely terrible things in places like Chile, and bombing Cambodia, Kissinger was an academic like Mearsheimer. And his whole focus was, and he was a more historically minded realist, but his whole argument is that if you get to a situation where each of the great powers is pretty happy with the way things are, you can have peace for a very long period of time. And his focus then was on the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 all the way up to World War I, sort of the longest period of general peace in European history, right? Yeah, there was a little Franco-Prussian War, there was a little Crimean War, but no big general war. And I've applied that same concept because the problem in Europe after 1991 is that one big power did not accept the status quo and wanted to revise it. And that was Russia.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that history is just cycles, and there's just going to be cycles of peace, and there's an inevitable conflict at the end of those cycles of peace?
Well, so there's a lot of research on that, and a lot of philosophizing on that, I might say. And I would just say the general realist view would be, yes, you can't escape the perils of an international system in which there's no central government. Like anarchy is what they call it. The system is anarchic, not meaning it's chaotic, but meaning there's no sovereign government, there's no police, and therefore this is going to happen from time to time. There is this other point of view that says maybe if enough states are democratic and can solve their problems differently, you can escape that. And that's kind of who, Mearsheimer is attacking.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I'm sort of in between, which is I would say, theoretically, you can imagine a world in which there are long periods of peace. But I'm not too optimistic that we're ever going to get beyond war. It's certainly not going to happen in my lifetime. Because even where you do have sovereignty, you still have civil wars.
I was about to say, is it possible to eventually get to the state of some sort of world government? And there might be some sort of civil conflict, but never on the scale of what we might have seen with World War II, for instance.
One could hope that, although, of course, some civil wars, one of the things that a lot of scholars have pointed out is that since World War II, far, far, far more people have been killed in civil wars than in international wars. Or in wars, you think about the conflict that followed the separation of the Raj into India and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. Partition.
Partition. Do we call that a civil war? Do we call that a post-colonial war? Do we call that whatever we call that? Right? How many people died? I mean, millions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, not quite on the scale of World War II, but some civil wars are very, very destructive in terms of life.
I mean, the American Civil War is a perfect example.
The American Civil War is a great example, and if a civil war was, instead of the North against the South, a new civil war was the Chinese part of a world state versus the Russian part of a world state, you can imagine many millions of people dying.
Mm-hmm.
There is a school of thought out there that says that over time, at all levels, international war, civil war, even like street gang warfare, that violence is declining.
Well, yeah. So Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature. This is the strong argument that just maybe it's incrementally, but essentially all throughout the world, if we look at the entire arc of history, violence has been declining, right? Yep. And there might be moments of explosive violence like we saw in the 20th century, but in general, he has all these graphs and charts to make his argument. I'm not sure how well that argument stands up. There's a lot of detractors to that argument, but is that the case?
I think Pinker and company I think their numbers are basically trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they've like completely missed something big or manipulated the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what do the numbers mean?
Well, we could be hopeful that the trend is getting better, that there is. I mean, so you could make the argument that, violence is a part of human nature, right? Like, so there's always been warring tribes. This is why we need systems to control that. But at the same time, interpersonal violence has been decreasing dramatically. I think that's inarguable.
Mm-hmm.
And so society is changing, but at the same time, there will always be certain people prone to violence. I don't think everybody is going to be, but there will be certain people prone to that. And I think the peaceful people of this world need to realize that, and then we have we have to exert power as well. And this is kind of what's happening at the world stage, right? If we don't do it, somebody else will.
Yeah, I think there's two arguments against sort of this Pinker optimism about the better angels. One is that it's a statistical artifact, right? If I take a perfectly fair coin and flip it 1,000 times, I'm going to get some pretty long streaks of all heads, right? And it doesn't suddenly mean that only heads are going to come up. It just means we happen to be on a very long streak of just heads. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an argument to be made that in the grand sweep of history, this decrease in violence hasn't lasted long enough or doesn't have any clear causes to believe that it's anything more than a lucky streak.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different argument, which is to say, no, there is something to it, but whatever it is that there is to it is reversible. And some are going to say that what we see happening right now with Russia is the reversal.
Yeah,
it's a country. It's a country going back to saying no, waging war on your neighbors and dropping bombs on them is a normal method of achieving foreign policy goals, as opposed to something that you only do when it's been absolutely forced on you.
Mm-hmm. It's been a little over a month now since Russia invaded Ukraine. This conflict drags on. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's created, millions of refugees.
Yep.
Probably, do we know the death count number? Is it in the hundreds of thousands?
I haven't seen good numbers yet. And of course,
it's hard to get good numbers.
It's hard to get good numbers. And there's a lot of reason for people to exaggerate the other side's casualties and underestimate their own. It's going to be very hard ever to get good numbers of casualties, especially on the Russian side.
The bottom line is it's a tragedy of immense scale.
Yep.
What is, over 4 weeks into this, like now, is there anything that you see developing that we could have hope for? Like how do you foresee the next few weeks?
I just want the hope. I always feel like you're talking to the wrong guy. The biggest thing I think we should take from this for those of us who analyze this stuff, right, and talk about it. The biggest thing we should take from the first 4 weeks is how wrong how many of us have been about almost everything so far, right?
Can you give me a couple of examples?
I've been studying this stuff for 30 years, right? And contrary to what Mearsheimer says, right, I was one of those people who for a long time was saying Russia's aggressive, right? Russia's trying to change the game. I did not think Russia would do this. And simply for the reason that it seems so contrary to Russian national interests. And I thought Putin was a Russian national interest guy. So we were almost all wrong about whether he would do it. But of course, every single prediction at the beginning was this is going to take days. And they're going to take out Kiev, right? And then after 3 days, the Russians had, sort of conquered Ukraine. There was like, okay, well, maybe it'll take a couple of weeks. Well, now we're a month in. The Ukrainians are counterattacking. And all I would say is we don't know what's going to happen on the battlefield. I hate to say this, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Russia suddenly has a couple of lucky breaks or gets its act together and very quickly cuts off Kiev. And then the whole complex of this war, the whole context of this war and complexion of this war changes. That's not the way things have been going for the last 3 weeks, but wars go back and forth. And so I just think we need to, above all, if after the first month of this war, we're not humble about our predictions, then we haven't been paying attention. Mm-hmm. That being said, let's make predictions. Reasons for hope. So I'll give you some reasons for hope. Is since I'm one of those that believes that Putin and this regime in Russia are extremely dangerous to all of Europe, I think the fact that they've met with such a lack of success is fantastic news. It's not fantastic news for the Ukrainians who are dying for this. It's fantastic for all the people who are going to benefit from that. The Poles, the Hungarians, all the people who because of the way this is going, are not going to have Russian tanks in their living rooms. So that's already accomplished in a way that even if Russia ends up fixing its mistakes or its problems in its military and taking over Ukraine, it will be chastened. Mm-hmm. That's good news. I think there is some potential. There are some signs that maybe Russia is moderating its aims. You mentioned this earlier. I won't be convinced until I see more evidence of it. If that were to happen, that would be a good thing too. It would be really, really good. And there are some signs of this, but again, I would not count on this yet. Right? That maybe Russia is starting to think about a deal. And this is a deal that I have to say, it's a deal that the Ukrainians would find incredibly hard to swallow. But, and here's where Mearsheimer and I might agree, which is at some point it might be better to take a terrible deal than to fight a war that, even though Russia may not be able to win it, Ukraine will find it very difficult to win the war. If the war means actually kicking the Russians out of Crimea, kicking the Russians out of the territory they've been occupying in eastern Ukraine. That's a tall order for anybody.
Okay. I just want to end on one last statement because Biden was in Europe recently, President Biden, and his recent comment caused a lot of, I can tell by the way you're shaking your head here. He essentially said, Putin cannot remain in power.
So I want to defend the president before I rip, just go to town on him, which is, it was an off-the-cuff remark, right? Off-the-cuff remarks should always be taken with a grain of salt. None of us is always especially good speaking spontaneously. We have a president who has this incredible capacity to step in it when he's speaking spontaneously.
He has a history of that.
He does. And, it wasn't the worst thing anybody's ever said, right? And he said, again, what a lot of people are thinking. The problem is that he said something that immediately required or enticed the French president, Macron, to come out and say, well, wait a second, right? So, of course, everybody would like to see the backside of Putin. It's a crazy thing because, number one, he's not going anywhere. Number two, that's not ours to decide. That's the Russian people's to decide. And number three, all it does is inflame him to say this. But the bigger reason why this was a mistake was that the whole strategic game for the West is for the West to stay unified. So anytime Biden says something that gets the French or the Germans or anybody else to say, wait a second, right, he's screwed up. To put it slightly differently, in following back from our Mearsheimer discussion, there's a lot of people who are very worried about U.S. power and influence in the world. And the more Biden and any U.S. leader cannot say anything publicly until they've worked it behind the scenes with the Europeans, the better off we are. Or to put it slightly differently, if you're going to come out apart from them and ahead of them, it better be for a very good reason, and the consequences should have been thought through. And this was one of those cases. There was nothing to gain. I don't think it's a gigantic crisis in the long term. It's just another stupid thing that came out of a president's mouth. Right.
But Putin has been using even more terse language recently. Is the risk of nuclear conflict increased since let's say we last spoke or from 2 weeks ago?
It's always there. There is this school of thought. There's the school of thought that says Putin cannot afford to lose this war, and therefore, if what it takes is the use of tactical nuclear weapons, he'll do it. I tend to still be fairly skeptical about that. I don't think he's completely off his nut. But there is no doubt that compared to a couple of weeks ago, it's not that it's gone to 50% likelihood that he'll do it. It's gone from maybe 1% to 2%, but that's double. And at some point it gets to be a real danger. And this is where, again, I think Mearsheimer is just so terrifically naive, even while he's claiming to be such a realist, which is, and there's a massive literature on this in international conflict, which is cheap talk. Right? You say things because you're trying to force the other side to make concessions. And so what Putin is saying is exactly what you would expect him to say, whether he has any intention of using nuclear weapons or not. Now, the problem is that's what we thought about him putting all these troops on Ukraine's borders, right? We thought, it's probably just a bluff. He's not going to really do it. And that's why I say I do think we have to take this more seriously now than we might have a month ago. Mm-hmm. There is this sense of, I would put it this way, we don't have our heads wrapped around Putin as well as we thought we did. And so, therefore, how much confidence should I have when I say he won't drop a nuke somewhere?
Yeah, everything he's done, it seems to be, like you said, you weren't even anticipating this invasion, that he would go that far. So it's safe to say, who knows what he's truly capable of. He does have a pattern of violent behavior on the world stage. It's dangerous. I think we all would like you said, to see the backside of him, but how that plays out is still to be seen. This is an ongoing conflict, and we can only hope for the best. Paul, thank you as always for your insights. We are going to continue these discussions every weekend and tie all of these current events into the bigger picture. So I appreciate it as always, Paul.
Sounds good. It's always great to talk with you.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Take care. You too.